All right. Hey, nerds. So, I'm going to continue my series on Less Than Nothing by one of my favorite philosophers, Slavoj Zizek, my favorite Hegelian slash Lacanian slash Marxist philosopher who's Slovenian and talks like this and sniffles a lot. But anyway, has some really interesting ideas, and I've talked about him many times before. And for the context of this paragraph that I'm going to go into, I should tell you who Deleuze is. I've mentioned him only a few times before, but he was heavily influenced by Foucault, who some of you know is my favorite 70s pervert post-structuralist philosopher. And they actually both influenced each other. And Deleuze he sounds weird. He's unlike Foucault, who Jordan Peterson endlessly strawmans as a Marxist. Deleuze actually was a Marxist, and he wrote some books with Guattari, and including like some of their most famous ones, like A Thousand Plateaus. And I've read some of philosophy or Deleuze's books, like What is Philosophy and A Thousand Plateaus, and Capitalism and Schizophrenia and A Thousand Plateaus are written by both Deleuze and Guattari. They wrote both of those books together. But this one, so that's kind of a tangent though, but you just need to know that, you know, a vague idea of who Deleuze is within the context of this paragraph. So he's a French Marxist philosopher who is influenced by Foucault, and Foucault was influenced by him. And some people think that they're both postmodernists, some idiots like fucking Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay, because they write in similarly, like, deliberately confusing, verbose and obtuse ways and needlessly pedantic ways. But they're not actually the same thing. Like, obviously, as I said, Deleuze is a Marxist, Foucault was not a Marxist, and they actually disagreed about a lot, even though they agreed about a lot. As you can probably tell, philosophers agree and disagree with each other all the time about various subjects. Duh, that's how people are. So anyway, I'll get into this paragraph here. So so he's talking about the Protestant motif of predestination. So the Protestant motif of predestination, remember, it's basically this idea that God has sealed our fate from before the time we were born and knows what's going to happen to us, and our fate after we die, our destiny has been predetermined. So it's like determinism from, like, basically a religious perspective, specifically Protestant, not Catholic, obviously. And Protestants, they had some more radical views at first, but now in today's world they're more like liberal, and then the other non-Protestants are way more reactionary. But anyway, so it's like basically predeterminism done by God. Basically, you could say predestination is. So the Protestant motif of predestination, far from being a reactionary theological motif, see, I said reactionary, right? Reactionary theological motif, predestination is a key element of the materialist theory of sense. So he's making a strange point here. He's saying that predestination is a key component of materialists' theory of sense. So our sense perceptions, does that mean our materialist thinks, Protestant materialists thought that our fate was predestined? You could say that, which is kind of odd for a materialist, because it's not very material to think that God, an immaterial being, influenced us material beings, right? But that's reflective of the way that Protestants were in the time period I think he's talking about anyway. So anyway, far from being a reactionary theological motif, predestination is a key element of the materialist theory of sense, on the condition that we read it along the lines of the Deleuzian opposition between the virtual and the actual. So you can just basically talk about this in a similar way to the way that Kant talks about synthetic claims, or a priori claims, or a posteriori claims. So you can talk about the virtual and the actual is what actually exists, and the virtual is something like the potential of what can exist. Okay, so this is Deleuze's idea of it. So it's not exactly the same as Kant, obviously, but there's a difference between the virtual and the actual. And you could say that's somewhat similar to what I've talked about with Heidegger in terms of actualization, right? Remember, Heidegger was obviously the famous 20th century phenomenologist who had a lot of influence on, well, actually, he's had a lot of influence on Slavoj Zizek as well, but also many other philosophers, including Deleuze. So anyway, there's a distinction between the virtual and the actual, which explains this idea that materialist idea of sense perception relies on predestination, which is an odd idea. So that only works if we read this along the lines of the Deleuzian opposition between the virtual and the actual. That is to say, predestination does not mean that our fate is sealed in an actual text existing from eternity in the divine mind. The texture which predestines us belongs to the purely virtual eternal past, which as such can be retroactively rewritten by our acts. So basically, he's saying that predestination doesn't mean that our fate is sealed, or our fate is sealed to the letter, every single granular aspect. So what actually predestines us is so we can say that the actual is what is actually happening now, because we are in the actual or the present. And oh yeah, so and he's talking about this in a strange way, like the way that Deleuze and Foucault, and particularly Deleuze writes, the way he writes is even stranger than the way Foucault writes. So basically, he's saying that so the past is virtual, and you could also say the future is virtual because they're not existing yet. Like the past already happened, so it's not in the actual, it's in the virtual. So the virtual is what's happening now, or not virtual, the actual. So the virtual is actually what's happening in the past and the future, and the actual is what actually is happening in reality with us right now. So this means that we can retroactively rewrite our acts as if they were predestined. So how do we know that it's actually predestination if things happened and then we retroactively say that they happened due to fate? So do you see what he's getting at here? He's saying that the actual and the virtual are distinct, but you can confuse the actual for the virtual, and you can confuse predestination for just random circumstances. So if you talk about, like, yeah, we can retroactively turn our actions from virtual into actual if we think this is part of predestination. So we can actually say that part of the virtual in the past that already happened was predestined, and then thus what happens to us now predestined, even though we don't know what is predestined or why it's predestined. So this, like, it's a more like paradoxical view of this, of course, which makes sense for Zizek, especially since he's a Hegelian, and Hegel likes to write that way. So anyway, in predestination, fate is substantialized. I think he made that word up. Fate is substantialized into a decision that precedes the process, so that the burden of individuals' activities is not to performatively constitute their fate, but to discover or guess their pre-existing fate. That makes sense, right? People are performatively performing what they think is their fate. We're performing what we believe to be our fate, but what we're actually doing is guessing our pre-existing fate. So you see, if we're talking about the virtual versus the actual, then are the virtual and the actual not really actually clear distinctions depending on how you talk about it? So you have to so you can guess the pre-existing future, and then you can retroactively say this was fate, this was predestination. So that's what he's saying, right? In terms of Protestant predestination, we can retcon things that happen and said, no, that was predestination, and this is a future, therefore it's predestination. But if I'm wrong about what happens in the future, that wasn't predestination. So therefore, how can it be predestination, right? But he's not like poking holes in predestination. He's talking about this particular perception on that subject. Okay, so you can retroactively in the present say that actions that already happened in the future were predestined, and you can say that actions that are happening in the future are predestined. So that means that you can make the virtual, which is the past, into the actual of the present because it has been predestined. And then similarly in the future, you can turn the virtual into the actual by predicting it now and then saying that, and then when it happens, saying that was predestined. So you see, based on whether you believe in fate or not, you can retroactively say that something was virtual or real, even though if it wasn't actually happened, like it already happened in the past or it's going to happen in the future. So the virtual becomes the actual in the future, and then in the past, the actual was the virtual. So the virtual is the virtual until it happens, or only at the moment when it happens, and then it becomes the actual later. So there's a distinction between the virtual and the actual, but through predestination, being looked at through a Deleuzian lens, you can turn the virtual into the actual. So there's making this sort of like a false dichotomy, but it's also a paradox in the sense that they're both separate things, but they can become one another. This paradoxical view, right? It's not like they could go together, but they're also essential to be separated. So the two halves are essential, but the whole is even more essential, and the two halves make up the part of the whole, which is this paradox. They're both two separate things that are also part of one major things, but each part is equally important. So what is the so we discover or guess our pre-existing fate. What is thereby obfuscated is the dialectical reversal of contingency into necessity. So similarly, if we're talking about things that already happened and we're saying it had to have happened that way, it could have just been contingent on the circumstances. So this makes us falsely believe into something that wasn't, that something that is not a necessity is actually is not that something that is a necessity is not actually a necessity, and it's a contingency. So if these factors are contingent, then they're not necessary, right? Because if they're contingent, that means they can change. Okay, so what is thereby obfuscated is the dialectical reversal of contingency into necessity. So people are falsely believing in predestination, basically. That is, the way the outcome of a contingent process takes on the appearance of necessity, things retroactively will have been necessary, right? So that's how he's talking about basically turning the virtual into the actual. So basically he's saying that this is why we can falsely believe in predestination, because the virtual becomes the actual, and then when it happens, we don't realize these contingent factors and believe that it's necessary. So this is basically Slavoj Zizek destroying the whole notion of fate and destiny. So basically, there is no fate. Factors are contingent, not necessary. So predestination is bullshit. Fate is bullshit. Destiny is bullshit. You can change it. If you can change your future, and the past has already happened, and you can actualize the past, then you can even say like time doesn't exist, man. It's confusing as fuck because it's Deleuze, right? And this is only Zizek talking about Deleuze. But this is why, like, through arguments, if that actually works, I'd say that this is Zizek's very unnecessarily obtuse, verbose, and pedantic way of just destroying the notion of fate and destiny. So, like Slavoj Zizek would say, fuck fate, fuck destiny. Yeah, there is no fate.